Thank you very much for joining us for another edition of the Filmmakers Forum. The Filmmakers Forum is an event of the Nollywood Studies Centre of the School of Media and Communication, Pan-Atlantic University. It's a forum that we use to facilitate engagement with members of the film industry and amongst the practitioners of the industry itself. So welcome once again. We are truly honored today to have as our guest, Mr. Ope Ajayi. Let me give a special welcome to you, Ope. Good to have you. Thank you very much for giving us of your time this morning. We hope we will have a truly engaging conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Ope Ajayi is a film producer and distributor. He's a founder and CEO of Cinemax Distribution Limited, a company that provides integrated services across various film subsectors, including production, distribution, and exhibition. With over 21 years of experience in business management, entertainment, and advisory, Ope spent a decade in the financial services sector, working with ARM, FCMB, Synergy Capital, and others before transitioning to the film industry. In 2012, he joined Genesis Cinema as general manager and later became its executive director, a position he held until 2022. During his tenure, he oversaw the cinema business and spearheaded multiple projects, including the construction and fitting out of 11 cinemas across Nigeria and the establishment of the first ever multiplex in Cameroon. In 2023, Cinemax undertook its first independent production, The Party. As founder and CEO of Captain of the Sea Productions, he has been involved as co-executive producer in the production and distribution of Queen Latifah in partnership with Wumi Toriola, Ada Omodadi, and Thin Line in partnership with Mercy Aigbe. Cinemax has also distributed several notable films, including Biodun Stevens' Sister, Hotel La Bamba, and Yemi Finboy Morafa's Silence. Ope Ajayi currently serves as the national chairman of the Cinema Exhibitors Association of Nigeria, CIAN. Once again, Ope, you are very welcome, and thank you for being with us. Now, as we go along, please, we will take questions from our audience. So please feel free to drop your to drop your questions in the chat. I will take them from there as we go along. Well, let's set the ball rolling, Ope. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Your first degree is in actuarial science, and you have a background in the financial services sector. But here you are today in the film industry. How did that come about?
Well, thanks again, and thanks for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I did study actuarial science in school, University of Lagos, and I mean went on to financial services. I think maybe what makes it what gives you more context is why I studied actuarial science, because I didn't know anything about actuarial science before I studied actuarial science. But my sister had a friend who seemed to be doing very successful at the time, who was actually successful. And I asked him, "Oh, what did you study in school?" I said actuarial science. I said, "Okay, you know what? That's what I'm going to study because I want to be like you." And I think I've said that story a few times because I think it's also important. Younger people need to have good role models. Yes. I think that it makes, and sometimes we see people doing a lot of fraudulent things, and that's because that's the role models that they see around them, So for me at the time, it was a big impression. I mean, eventually I didn't quite enjoy actuarial science, but I went through with it. But it gave me a background in mathematics, statistics, and and all of that. I stumbled on filmmaking by accident. So shortly after about 10 years or so in financial services, I was first doing some consulting work because I wanted to, be on my own. And a friend of mine said to me, "Look, there's a company that needs some work." He was consulting for them, which was Genesis at the time, So, and I met the owner. And long story short, they offered me a job, and I said, "Take it on," and that's how I got into the film. industry through cinemas. So it wasn't something that I actually planned. It was more like I just stumbled on it. And even at the time, I said, you know what, let's see what it's like for a year or so and decide whether or not to, this is what I wanted. I ended up spending 10 years in Genesis. Yeah, so it was, I think I sort of just found my passion in film, in telling stories. And, I'm lucky to have been able to work across the entire value chain from production to distribution to exhibition. And yeah, in January 2023, started Cinemax. So it's been 2 years with Cinemax. And Cinemax, is focused a bit more on distribution and production, even though we also manage a couple of cinemas as well. But we do a lot more production and distribution. And that's pretty much, that's really the long and short of the story. I mean, except the specifics that you want to know, but that's how I got here.
Actually, I am a bit curious because one of the problems, especially at the beginning, the early phases of the industry, because I remember conversations we had at that time with persons from the bank, and as financial persons, they found it very difficult to understand the industry because the aspect of, okay, where is the investment money going? How am I going to get my money back, given the lack of structure and so on? And now you, as a financial person with all of the structure that you have, that you depend on, entered into this industry, especially early on. How did you find it? Was this a difficulty for you? Because financial persons I know have complained a lot about the difficulty of understanding the way the industry functions. How was it for you?
A really huge culture shock coming from a structured environment. So yes, I totally understand that. I get that when people say that, but the strange thing is also and while I think that we need to continue to move the industry towards more structure, I think that there's been definitely a lot of progress over the last 10 to 15 years. I think that fluidity sometimes is also it's what has brought about a lot of the creativity and a lot of the progress that we have made. If you compare Nollywood to other industries in the world, people hardly use their money to make films. They make films with grants, with government funding, and so on and so forth. Nigeria is one of the very few self-funded industries in the world, that has grown to be this much. It's also because there's a sense of a lot of people are driven by passion and driven by just interest. So yes, it's quite unstructured. It was a bit of a struggle in the first few years. But I think that, like I said, it turned out that there are things that I really, really enjoyed. I enjoyed the idea of communal viewing of movies. I enjoyed just telling stories. I liked what good movies did to people. I like stories that create conversations, and people tend to see themselves in the movies. So there's a certain gift that storytelling gives to us as humanity that I found a lot stronger than any of the other issues that I had. It also helped that I started from cinemas, because cinemas are a lot more structured than maybe other aspects of the business. Because I mean, the cinema chains and even the independent cinemas all have proper structures. I mean, people sometimes will come to my office back in the day and say, "Oh, what are you doing with all of this in this office?" I'm like, "We have supply chain, we have everything else. We have an accounting department, we have an HR department, we have everything else that a business has. It's not, it's not just just play a projector and show a movie. We have and all of that. So it helps that's where I started from, and then gradually into distribution and production, all of that. But yes, there are issues of lack of structure, but I think there's a positive side and the negative side of it, and I tend to lean more to the positive and see how we can build an industry that is beneficial for all players.
I would like to think that your background in finance has played a key role now in helping you to build the business you have currently. Is that the case? It helps you really, especially when you talk about the actuarial science, helping you to foresee some of the financial ends of things. Is that the case? Would you say that it's a great advantage for anybody entering into the industry to have a bit of this understanding of the way the finance figures work?
I mean, so obviously not everyone is going to have finance background, but it definitely helps. So even while at Genesis and in currently starting up Cinemax, I was able to raise money because I understand investor language. I understand what returns. I understand what they're looking for. I know that investors want to be part of a great story, but at the end of the day, if you don't turn the money around and pay them back, then you're not going to go very far, right? I'm very comfortable talking to banks, whether it is, and I know the implications of loans, whether it is the Bank of Industry loans that come with a longer moratorium, or it's a commercial loan and all that. So that definitely helps me. Major contributor to what I've been able to do, not only in the last 2 years, but even in the last 14, 15 years.
Tell us a little bit about Cinemax Distribution Limited. Yes, when we hear the word distribution, we say we know what you do and so on and so forth. But you can tell us about that. How does it function if people, because we have in our audience people perhaps who have films they want to place and so on. How do you function? And yes, how can people reach you and all of that kind of thing? What is your spread as a distribution company?
So I'll talk about what distributors do, then I'll talk about what we do. So generally, distributors generally tend to look for the best films and monetize them over a period across cinemas, across streaming, across airlines, and all the entire value chain. That's typically what we generally define what distributors do. Generally speaking. In our own case, we're slightly different because we also produce, and typically we like to get involved from the beginning. So there will be films that we distribute just because we like the film, we like the story, and we think that the film has potential. But generally speaking, we like to get involved even from development phase, from idea phase, because because of how fragmented the industry is as well. We need to know for sure, where is this film going? Yes, you want to tell a story, but is it going to go to cinemas? Is it going to go to streaming? Can it do both? Is it going to go to YouTube? Is it going to go wherever it's going to go? Because those things matter. It matters from the beginning, before you even tell the story. It determines who you cast, how you structure it, what equipment you use, how you market it, how you position it. So we typically like to get involved from story development from the beginning, from when the idea has even, has come. Obviously, at the point where there's not just an idea, there's at least capacity to also execute the idea, because there are 1 million ideas, right? So there's the idea and the capacity to execute the idea. So at that stage, we like to, if there's projects that we want to get involved in, we want to get involved in that stage, because we think that because of our experience, we can add significantly a lot more value across the entire process, and it can determine whether or not, to a large extent, the process fails or succeeds. And I say that because most people really have a story idea, they want to tell a story, they like an actor, they like this, they like that, which is great. Sometimes the actor that you want to cast may not necessarily be suited for that role, or may be suited for that role but is not a commercial actor, because truly there are also actors that are great actors, but they're actors that have a fan base. So sometimes where the film is going determines a lot of how that is structured. That's that's the business of film, right? It's beyond now the filmmaking. So for us to be able to add value, we like to do all of that. What that means is in a year we maybe do maximum of 6 films. Let's say 6 to 8 films, of which perhaps 2 of those films are films that are co-productions of ours. In other words, co-productions, we've invested in those films. 2 or 3 of those films may be films that we have an interest in, while the other films are just films that we like and we're able to advise all through. So that's pretty much how we work. Also, because we also think that we want to play a quality game, not a quantity game, because there are a million films in the market. So we want to, obviously in our first year, we did films that, maybe we shouldn't have done. I don't want to, but we, even though I like every film, and there's a reason why I did all of those films, I knew some of those films would not be as commercially successful, but I thought there was something special about them. But even as we grow, we want to actually reduce the number of films that we distribute. I know that doesn't sound great, but that's what we want to do, because we want every film we release to be an event. So if we do 6 films a year, we want those 6 films to be obviously not every film is going to make, billions of naira or even hundreds of millions, but we want every release to be an event. So even if we end up doing one film a quarter, let it be a film that it makes an impact, So that's sort of how our own strategy is as a company. So let's say 4 to 8 films a year, films that have high impact. Sometimes impact is not just box office, it's maybe people talk about it, it's something that generates conversation. It's a new filmmaker who's never done something before. So we always try to also do all of that. So I mean, just it can be a genre that people have not, that typically doesn't come to cinema. So we want every film to have something special about them, and I think we've pretty much stuck to that since we started our business.
It's very interesting that you say that, because it gives the impression now that you are trying to stand out from the crowd by the way you approach a specific kind, well, maybe that's not the right way to put it, specific kind of film, no, but a film that goes beyond merely just producing something that will make money, but will have really, dare I say, social impact. Would that be a right term to use?
Well, I won't say social impact, but I would say social impact sounds a bit charity-ish kind of, So it's not it's not social. It's not necessarily social impact.
Yes.
Or it can be something. So I mean, it can be something from even like in the last 18 months, we worked with 3 first-time producers. That's not something that people usually do. And those films have gone on to make, quite some significant success. So it doesn't have to be that it's social impact, but it must be. We just, as much as possible, try and look for films that different. And so different can be, it's not a typical story. It doesn't end the typical way, and all of that. While also still looking at the commercial. And the reason why I don't want to use social impact is because at the end of the day, the numbers still have to make sense, and it has to add up for everyone, So yeah.
Right. Actually, why my mind went to the term social impact is, well, linked to an article that appeared in the periodical, which states that at the core of Cinemax's philosophy is a deep commitment to supporting local filmmakers by partnering with a diverse range of creators. Okay, so it's not really just social in the sense of being charitable, but you're also trying, and it was something you said as well, that you try to work with young filmmakers who have not previously produced. That requires taking a risk.
It does.
I would like to think that this is your own way of, you could say, growing the industry. Is that right? Would I be right in saying that?
You're correct. So the reason why I run away from social is because we're also not just going to do it because we're just trying. Yeah. So last year, the second highest grossing film in cinemas, Queen Latifah, was from a first-time producer. She's never done cinema before. She's very big on YouTube. She's big on other platforms. And we thought that we could bring this person to an entirely new space and make an impact. And we're right. Ended up being the second highest grossing film of the year. It was a great experience for her. It was a great experience for us. But yeah, it was a big risk because people said, "Oh, who is she?" Well, in the cinema circles, we're like, "Oh, we don't know her. We don't, and all of that." So it requires a lot more work and effort, to break in that. So but we also enjoy that process as well. It's something that gives us the thrill. But guys will say, "I told you," and then and usually also, I also actually strongly believe that so it does 2 things for us. Number one, that's the only way, in my view, to expand the market, to grow the market, and to bring in a new audience. You bring in a new audience by bringing in new stars that, they may not be known in certain areas, but, there are people who know them. The second thing for us as a company was the big names, in quotes. A lot of them were not going to take a chance on us because we're just starting, even though, I've been in this for a while. So it worked out as well for us to say, you know what, and I'm also not going to, in quotes, go and, so I will try and get the bigger names, but I'm also happy to build a new set of big names because those big names who are big names today started from somewhere. Somebody took a chance on them as well. So let's take a chance on each other, and that way there's a pool of, I would say, mid to upcoming actors and producers that we're working with and developing with that can potentially in the next 3 to 5 years become the big names that everyone is looking for, So
Right.
that's at the core of our strategy.
Right. Well, Helen has dropped in the chat here a useful point that social impact is not charity. It brings development in the sector and profit for the producers. Great idea. But now the question is, how do you find these young filmmakers? How do you find these people that you then set out to groom? There probably will be one or two persons in the audience here who would like to get into that group. So what do you have any pathway that people say, yeah, I want to do this? How can I reach you, for instance? What is your process?
So first of all, people can reach us, on Instagram, via email. My email is ope@cinemaxdr.com, and I can type that later on in the chat box. But generally, what we do is, and so let me define young. Young doesn't necessarily mean they're 21. Sometimes you have people who've been in the industry for a long time and they haven't done cinema before. Or you have people who have a fan base in a certain area. So yes, they can be young, but they're not always young. It really just depends. But we also don't want to, in quotes, start from the beginning. So you sort of have to show that you've done something. You have some body of work. You've maybe done films on a certain platform. You've had a certain level. You've tested a few things. It usually helps, when we're co-producing with anyone. Typically, they also have some of their own money as well. We're not going to bankroll someone's entire project because these are also investors' funds, and you also need to have a skin in the game. So those are some of the things we look out for. It also helps that people have been on other people's projects, so they at least know, they have an idea what it's been like. So some of the people we've worked with, they've been on other people's projects, they've worked on other platforms, they've done other things, so they're not green, they're not entirely new, in that sense. But they're not yet quite there yet, but the potential is there. So we sort of feel that what we can help to bring out that potential. So that's
in other words, it's what the advisors usually given to young, budding filmmakers, that try and develop a body of your own work, even if it is that you just take a camera and shoot something with your friends, but have something that people can see, make your presence felt in some way. Definitely. Very good advice. Yes, thank you. Now, you mentioned the aspect of production. It's something that in the Nigerian space appears to have become rather, should I use the word common? That you find distribution companies that are also into production. And in many cases, they also have an exhibition arm. In an interview we had with Joy F.A.O.D.T., the CEO of Blue Pictures, she pointed out that it was not really something that they wanted to do, but that the realities of the market, of the Nigerian market, drove them to do that. And it's something that in the future, they will very happily give up to break up that structure. What led you to this point of now going into production as a distribution company?
It's a bit different for me. I think that I always wanted to do production. And so let me just say I wanted to tell stories. So in my own case, I felt that there are certain stories that are not being told. And even when they're being told in, from one lens, from one perspective. I think that, and this maybe this is the social part of me now talking, but for people for us to have a fully developed society, you have to hear different sides of things. So I'm very big on stories that I sometimes when I watch films, I feel like, great films, but it's from one angle, There's a film that was released on Netflix, Adam Odade, even though we have a bit of technical issue that is being resolved, but it's on Netflix right now with Messi Aigbe. And it's again a story about someone who was abandoned, and a girl who was abandoned by her father, and so on and so forth. And we guess you watch it on Netflix. But the point is, those stories sort of give I particularly like that kind of story because it gives a different angle to things. Obviously, people will argue about whether or not they liked the way it ended. Another film that I really like was Star. I'm just giving you some examples by Biodun Stills.
Yes.
Which was, and if you people have seen it, it was also, people talked about it and people had different views about it, and people thought, oh, you shouldn't have forgiven him and all of that. I just really like stories that give, more varying views, right? Or maybe it tells a story from a different lens, and all of that. And so for me, that's my reason for going into production. So it's really a case of, so that's why if there's a story that I don't like, or I'm not really, no matter how great, even if I think the story is going to make a lot of money, if I don't really see, if I think that it doesn't do anything new for the market, I may not do it, because I think that we need to have different stories. I think we need to have better stories told. I love stories that, both parties are right, everybody's right and everybody's wrong at the same time, and it creates a lot of conversation. So I'm more prone towards drama, thriller sort of stories. So for me, it was always a passion, right? Distribution, I started from, like I mentioned earlier, I stumbled into exhibition, I loved it, and then, started Genesis Pictures while I was at Genesis. So it was only natural for me to also start off, in distribution, because I also felt, look, the market has changed. Over the last 10 years, the market changed a lot, and multiple platforms, streaming, as everyone knows, became the big deal. So to play in those markets, obviously distribution is the first place to sort of, build capacity, and obviously I already developed a network from there. So for me, production or filmmaking was something I was passionate about. Distribution for me is business, because you have to sell, and you have to sell the films that you make, whether it's your film or other people's films. Exhibition, my involvement in exhibition is because, again, it's an industry that I know very well. It's a subsector I know very well. I built about 9 cinemas while at Genesis, so I know that entire process and how it works, and to ensure you have a great experience. I know that there are controversies around people playing across the value chain. I see it slightly differently, controversially so. I see it slightly differently because, speaking, let's say, for example, from the cinema side of things, which is really where the controversy is, the big chains owning cinemas, owning production companies and so on and so forth. I think that there was a time in this country where the quality of most Nollywood films were also very bad. As you know, the industry was very unstructured, and very few people were investing even in the business. So really, the exhibitors too will say to you, and I can say this because I've been on all the sites, and I'm on all the sites, will say to you that we have to do production because we need content for our cinemas as well, right? It's the same. So sometimes we forget that cinemas are also platforms. It's just that they're physical platforms. It's the same reason why Netflix will commission content, because they can't really wait for, particularly when they know what works. You're not necessarily going to wait for the content to come to you. So yes, you will take content, but you commission your own content as well. So it actually works. I think perhaps there should be better guidelines as to how it is managed, but in the real sense of it is what it is. A distributor, nobody's stopping the distributor from also building out their own cinemas, or going into production, case maybe. Typically, what will happen is that you'll be stronger in one place than the other place, and usually you'll be stronger where your passion lies. So you can have a cinema chain, but because you're not really maybe storytelling is not your passion, you may not be the best producer in quotes. You can commission films and own part of films, but you're not necessarily going to be that if it's not something that is your passion. Similarly, if you're a producer, and we have producers who now own cinemas, that cinema is not necessarily going to be, you're not going to expand and become the biggest chain, because that's not really your passion either as well. So I think that it depends on how you look at it. But me personally, I think storytelling has been something that I've always wanted to do. So it was a good opportunity to exploit. I think we've also shown that we know a thing or two about storytelling, and that value we've added it to the people that we distribute for, and we also we partner with. So yeah.
Great. There's a lot of talk these days about the need to tell authentic African stories, because I would say that that's a very vague term, really. What exactly is an African story? But in line with what you have said about telling stories from different perspectives and so on, how would you say it fits into this notion of, okay, telling authentic stories? There are people who have complained that we have lost something from the early days of Nollywood, because they say many of the stories that are coming out today are not quite the same authentic, or rather do not possess the same authenticity as those early stories did. What would be your view on that? And really, are you also concerned about this whole notion about telling authentic stories which are of us, so to speak?
It's a very it's a tricky question, and there's no right or wrong. That's not what I mean. Like you rightly said, authentic is big. So now, what I think what happened time is also that as people grow older, there's a new generation. What is authentic to my 15-year-old son is not authentic to me. So what is authentic story? Sometimes it's very difficult to determine. Also, and I think we all just have to come to terms, and what I've come to terms with is that I like relatability. So what I find relatable, you may not find relatable, but it doesn't make it unauthentic. Obviously, there's some things that are definitely, I mean, nobody really understands what's going on. But generally speaking, African stories, you also cannot put African stories into a box. Say this is what African stories should be like, and I think that's where the challenge is, because the films that do ridiculously well at the box office in Nigeria or even streaming, and you have people saying you don't understand what is so good about the film. That's also because perhaps they don't find it relatable. And I remember, and I'll give an example because it's an old film, so I can speak about it. Wedding Party 1 came out in cinemas back in the day, and it did so well. And I remember that most people loved it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was the best thing. And I know that I had a few friends who just didn't understand what the hype was about. But more interestingly, they were, specifically speaking, they were from Jos, they were from the Middle Belt. So I think they didn't really get the culture, the things that we find relatable. They didn't really find it. I mean, it was nice that they can understand it, but it didn't stir up any emotions in them. And that's when I realized that, what you may find particularly exciting for you, another person may not. Obviously, there are stories that cuts across almost everyone, and people can, relate and all of that. But I think generally speaking, the world is so diverse, from all over the world, because there's so much influence West and influence different parts of the world in our daily life today. It's becoming harder and harder to define what a core African story is. That's what I think. I think that at the end of the day, relatability is really, what it is. The last 2-3 years, as you know, there's been an influx of epic films on streaming platforms, and I just enjoy them. But a number of people who don't understand what is this about? What is the excitement about the epic films? Do you get what I'm saying? Like it's people are sick. Some people are even just tired. So it's a very interesting. It's quite it's can be. I mean, I don't know what right or wrong answer is, but I think generally speaking, African stories can be defined by whoever wants to define it in whatever context. And it's very difficult to say this is African, this is not African. because I don't relate to it doesn't make it un-African, So I think that's
Actually, I fully agree with you, because I've always found it like a catch-all kind of phrase. When you say African, Nigeria alone, with 250 plus tribes and cultures and so on, is it really possible that in the whole of Africa, you say there's just one defining feature that you see as this is Africa? There are so many angles. There are so many different possibilities, really. So it's richer than just one term can capture. Now, let's turn a little in a slightly different direction. You spoke about the fact that, especially at the beginning, when you joined the industry, there were challenges with aspects of, well, with the lack of structure. Now, one of the beautiful things which has happened is the establishment of the Cinema Exhibitors Association of Nigeria, because I think it has helped a lot in terms of providing data, which is something we tend to lack quite a bit. And I think it's doing a great job. Now, you are currently the chairman of CM, the Cinema Exhibitors Association of Nigeria. I don't think perhaps too many people are aware of this body and what it does. So can you tell us what is the role of this body, apart from the fact that it produces marvelous data, which I am very happy with? Now, what does it do? How does it function?
Okay, so CN represents all the cinemas in Nigeria. If you don't belong to CN, you're typically not able to get movies. The reason for that is because we also need to keep a lead on piracy. So CN members are supposed to use a certain technology called the DCP technology, which protects content, from leaking, and all of that. So that's one of the main cause, really, to fight against piracy. So we sort of create that. So we encourage members who want to start cinemas to join us and tell them what technology to use for their projection, so that we give them content, and we work with Feeden, which is headed by Joy, to ensure that we give them content in that format to ensure protection of the films, because it's critical that films are protected. When films leaks, everybody loses money: the cinema, the producer, everyone. Okay, so that's number two. Obviously, is data, which you rightly said. Again, it was in a bid to sort of create transparency, so people can at least have an idea of what the numbers are and how the industry is doing, particularly the stakeholders, producers, distributors, and so on and so forth. Because data, traditionally has been a very it's an area of contention, but I think we've as much as possible, we try and ensure that every week we release the numbers on what is going on in the box office. Beyond that, our role is really to ensure that people are compliant with standards as much as possible. We obviously belong to the guild of there's a guild of all Nollywood guilds. There's a Nollywood. There's a general guild which everyone belongs to, and the whole point is, again, how do we foster the growth of Nollywood? How do we foster the growth of the industry? So we work with them as well in that regard. But generally speaking, it's really, I would say, the core thing is piracy, is data, to fight against piracy, data, form cohesion amongst members. There's always also sometimes dispute resolution and so on and so forth among cinemas. And then when we have cases where other administrative cases, maybe cinema is owing somebody is owing this, all of that is handled within CN. But generally, our goal is also to promote cinema culture. We think that, and even with the streamers, everyone, I think, agrees that the cinema culture is very important to the movie business as a whole. People going to cinemas, watching films together is something that we have to continue to promote. So at the heart of it, we're succeeding when people are going to the cinemas, when admissions are growing, when box office revenue is growing, and when we also ensure that there's cohesion in the industry. Obviously, to achieve that, we have to also do the other things, like ensure that we're tracking the data, ensure that there's no piracy, ensure that people are keeping to standards. So that's, in a nutshell, is what we do at CN.
Lovely, good to know. Well, just a reminder to the audience, please drop your questions if you have any in the chat box, and we'll take them from there. You said something now about growing cinema attendance. It is said that cinema attendance worldwide has dropped. I have seen comments to this effect, but especially following the COVID pandemic. However, here in Nigeria, the reverse appears to be the case. The data, which is captured in Film One's Nigerian box office yearbook, indicates that admissions have been increasing in the last 2 years. From your perspective, what would you say are the drivers here?
Okay, so it was last year was the first time we grew in admissions, actually. The previous year was a decline. So globally, admissions have been declining, globally. Last year, we boxed the trend, even though the previous year as well, we've been growing in box office, right? Revenue, rather, consistently because of price increase. But last year, I think we finally turned the corner because we grew in box office revenue. We also grew in admissions. But the reason for that, and this also is what has happened in every country that has bucked the trend. The reason for that is that we have a strong production base. We have strong local content. Almost every other country that doesn't have local content continues to be on a decline from across Africa and South Africa, even in Europe. But I think a few countries like Germany, I think France, I can't remember now, but a few countries in Europe, but Nigeria stands out as one of the countries that continues to grow. Both even when we were growing in box office and not growing in admissions, others were not even growing in box office revenue. Obviously, our situation is a bit different because there's high inflation, so prices went up and all of that. But the key thing is that we have a vibrant Nollywood is the reason, more or less, which is why, and more, whenever I have the opportunity to talk about it, even with cinemas, I'm like, look, Nollywood is so important to our business. A lot of people don't realize how a lot of other countries are dependent on Hollywood. Without Hollywood, there is no cinema business. Right. Countries like Nigeria, India are a bit different. India too is a brilliant country where at some point Hollywood was doing 70% of their cinema business. In our own case, it's about 48% or 46%, which is amazing. So even throughout COVID, when people were completely shut down, even though our numbers were low, we were still trading because we had Nigerian content. Yes. So for us, I think it's something to be really proud of, and that's the major reason. So, now that Hollywood seems to be coming back, we have Hollywood, we have Nollywood, and then so our growth is even going to be more phenomenal. That's the expectation over the next 5 years, because Nollywood gets stronger, Hollywood gets stronger, because as after COVID, there was also issues around strikes, all sorts of in Hollywood, writer strike and so on and so forth, that affected delays, so content was really a struggle to come by. So in a nutshell, the main reason is Nollywood. That's in a nutshell. That's why we're growing as an industry.
Thank you. Actually, what you said, it was also a question I had penned down, because looking at the yearbook, I found it very interesting that it said that Nollywood films are standing their own and are actually doing better in the Nigerian box office than the Hollywood films, which was not the case previously. Yes. And in a recent interview, you are quoted as saying, for the first time ever, we expect Nollywood to contribute more to the box office than Hollywood in 2025, while also projecting a 40% growth on last year's box office. You have given part of the reason now, that we have a strong production base, but are there other reasons for your optimism in this regard?
Well, I think that beyond the fact that we have the content locally, beyond also the fact that I think Hollywood is going to be strong this year. I think last year or the last 2 years were adjustment years, generally speaking, with fuel subsidy, with the exchange rate. So I think that the shocks, economically speaking, from the macroeconomic level, is done more or less. We don't expect any more significant shocks. So that's even why last year was more phenomenal, because this was also still in the middle of a lot of economic adjustments and all of that. So with a bit more stability, I think that would help, generally speaking. And so that's not peculiar to the Nigerian film industry alone. That's peculiar to, I think that's going to happen with a lot of industries. So I think those are the things that are driving my optimism. Also, last 2 years, there's been quite a significant price increase, which also sometimes affects admissions, even in the cinema sector. I don't think we're going to have that level of increase this year again, because inflation is not as bad as it used to be, and I think that we'll find the right price points. So that stability, increased content from both Nollywood and Hollywood, I think will go a long way. Obviously, there are also a number of cinemas planning to open as well, this year, which we're also aware of. So the expectation is that will drive growth in the subsector and in the industry as a whole.
Well, linked to what you've just said about cinemas opening, there's a question here from Oluranti, who's asking, how many cinema houses do we have in Nigeria currently?
We have about 300 screens, I think, and about 50-something companies. There are about 57 companies. So now this includes independents and circuits, right? So, but yeah, I think the number of screens is really what, and which shows that there's massive room for growth as well in the industry. So about 300 screens.
I think that ties into the question of Olaniyi, who's asking, what is your view on having more community cinemas? Because if we look at the spread of cinema houses, we see that they're largely restricted to the larger cities and towns. And in some states, for instance, you find out that there's perhaps just one or two major cinemas. And people have been speaking a lot about the need for community cinemas to really, in quote, get to the grassroots and also have a structure which is more accessible for people's pockets. So Olani is asking, what is your view on having more community cinemas?
So I've been guessing this question for I don't know how many years, but my answer is usually the same, which is, what exactly are community cinemas? And how do we define what community cinemas are? And I think that's the first thing. I don't think that anyone has really defined community cinemas. And I'll tell you why I say that. To set up a proper cinema, you need the seats, you need air conditioning, you need projectors, you need a concession stand, you need food and all of that. And while this can be in grades, usually the question is, if you're going to invest that amount of money, in setting up, you need soundproofing if you're going to have a good experience. What makes it a community cinema, is really the question. So, because to set up a cinema properly, you're going to go into a few hundreds of millions. So the question then is, if you're going to make that investment, you're going to look for the place where you can perhaps recoup your investment back as quickly as possible. So while I think that the opportunity is there, and I don't have any doubt that we still have opportunity to expand, I also don't know that I think we're sometimes a bit over-optimistic about the potential of more cinemas. I think so. I think perhaps the closest we can do to define a community cinema is a cinema that shows only Nollywood movies. I think that potentially may be what a community cinema will be, if we want to define it. Because if you're going to buy what you call a DCP, DCI projector that plays Hollywood, the cheapest you find is, say, maybe about $35,000 for brand new. So if you have two screens and you buy two of that, you spend $7,000 without shipping and all of that. So that means you set up two screens with your sound and your screen, maybe you spend $100,000 already. So are you going to invest that in a rural area? I don't know that anybody wants to do that, or in a place where not even rural, in a place where there is no financial capacity to afford it. So I think that's where usually for me the confusion is. But perhaps because you can get projectors that, again, using the term DCP, but not for Hollywood, not DCI compliant, that cost you maybe less than 5 million naira in total. So in that case, you can have a Nollywood cinema, and perhaps that's what will then become what we call a community cinema. So your startup cost is not necessarily as high. And if your startup cost is not high, then your pricing can be low, everything else can be low, and perhaps you can do seats locally instead of trying to import seats that are recliners and so on and so forth. So then you can then perhaps have a community cinema. But in my mind, once you start to show Hollywood, which means you have to buy yourself the sort of infrastructure to show Hollywood, you have moved away from community cinema, and that's really where it's always a bit of a struggle. But with Nollywood contributing close to 50% of the films, it might be worth trying. I'm not the one that's going to try it, but it might be worth trying a cinema that shows only in Hollywood. I wonder if someone, I know a lot of people have talked about it for years, but it will be, that's what I think about it. So I think that community cinemas is always a nice thing to say, but I don't know that anyone has actually really defined what it is. Even at the banks, when they ask me, "Oh, community cinemas," I'm like, okay, what are community cinemas exactly? So. But yeah, I think perhaps maybe community cinemas, now that we have an industry that produces half of the content that we show, there might be, it may be a model that may work. I don't know that it's been tested where we're only showing Nigerian movies. It worked in India, by the way. Sorry to say, it worked in India at some point, where it worked for a while because there were cinemas in India. There are one-screen cinemas. They're big, not multiplexes, just one screen with maybe 200 seats or 300 seats, and they play only Bollywood. But over time, they also started to upgrade those cinemas to be able to show both Hollywood and Hollywood. Because I don't know that the economics work long term. I don't know, but.
I think it's a fascinating discussion, really. This thing you said about about community cinemas being equated to Nollywood cinemas. Because I have always thought rather that and you refer to something along those lines, that an industry that can depend on its local audience, that has a strong local base, in the long run, you could say has some advantages. And for instance, it came to my attention recently, the success of the Chinese animated blockbuster, Neza 2. And this is a film which has amassed in a total box office of $2.27 billion. But then the striking thing is that 99% of that amount came from the local audience, which I think is very striking that they get most of the income, most of the revenue from the local audience, demonstrating the strength of that local audience of supporting their own industry. And then if we turn to the Nigerian situation, Everybody Loves Jennifer, for instance, made 1.1 billion naira, 730,000 plus dollars within 3 weeks of its release. And this is with a limited number of cinemas. And that is just, that month alone, the total number of cinema goers was put at 538,341. And it strikes me that this hardly scratches the surface of the population of the country. Now, if we had, certainly not films at that level, because we have people now posting their films to YouTube and so on and so forth. But if we had these kind of cinemas that you spoke about, Nollywood cinemas dedicated to showing things which perhaps may not be at the kind of level that you say, yes, we have to then put in the kind of structures that require that protection. Don't you think that this will be a good funding base for the industry? Because now you're reaching more people, even though they're not paying as much, but at the same time, it can be a strong source of income in terms of really hitting high numbers with the box office. What will be your thoughts on this?
So so the thing about it is, and Everybody Loves Jennifer, as you know, is the highest grossing film, ever. It came in December. Usually, these films come in December as well. There are a number of seasons in the course of the year that have very strong admissions.
Right.
I think the question is, what happens in February where there's no ELJ and there's no strong Hollywood in cool, and there's no, let's say the cinemas don't run Hollywood. What happens in March? There's no good Hollywood. Perhaps April will be a good month because of Easter. But what happens in May and June when perhaps everybody else is showing, say, Fast and Furious, and all of that? And what happens in July and August where maybe it's Hollywood dominated and there's not a lot of Nollywood? I think the question is, how does that cinema sustain for 12 months? So there's no doubt that if there were more of those cinemas, it will help the producers to make more money. There's no doubt about that. But the sustainability of that cinema model is the question on how is it able to run? Because the thing about cinema business is a high overhead business. Whether you so the cinema owner doesn't care whether you're showing Hollywood or Nollywood. His overheads doesn't know whether it's Hollywood or Nollywood that is filling the screens, or it's church service that they're using the screens for. The point is that they need to generate revenue from those cinemas. So when you have in a country like Nigeria where you have the luxury of having both Hollywood and Nollywood, then it's great. But what happens when you don't? So let's take last year, for example, say from end of September, where Queen Latifah released and Farmer's Bride released. That would have been a good month going into October, right? But in November, and then there was Wives on Strike, so October was a very strong month. But then November, what was in cinema was Moana and this Denzel Washington film Gladiators. So what are you going to do if you can't show those films during that whole November period? What are you going to do? You get what I'm saying? So it's a bit, or you have a December without Lion King. It's a bit. I don't know how sustainable it is. So while we have such an important Nollywood, and we're very lucky to have an industry that is driven to a large extent by Nollywood, Hollywood still remains so critical to profitability. It's the same way other countries that don't have a local industry are not making money because it's only Hollywood they have. That will then be what will happen if we only had Nollywood. So we actually need both to drive it, which is why I'm not entirely sure. But again, I'm not entirely sure about that model where you can only you have community cinemas that are showing Nigerian films. Clearly, it would be great for Nigerian films. But how do they run their overheads? How do they manage their costs? How do they pay their staff when there is no Nigerian film in the cinema? Those are the other details that one needs to perhaps look at, to see whether or not it's actually a viable model or not.
But does this take into consideration the fact that there are Nigerians who are really not keen at all on Hollywood? Because I know that audience analysis that has been carried out, there are some people who watch only Nollywood. Or do you think that the number will not be enough of those who really have that preference?
No, so I know that there's a very large number of people, they don't even care about Hollywood. You can shout Captain America from now till forever. They're not interested. they're not interested. There are obviously those that watch both. And then there are those who are just Hollywood, we don't watch anything else. But I think I don't think anyone has been able to answer by trying it out in a model is whether the Nollywood watchers are enough to sustain that business, for a 12-year period. Okay. So it's not that it's actually worth trying. It's just that I don't know for sure. And so the safer thing to do is to maybe have a hybrid model. If you have 3 screens, you have one screen that shows Nollywood and Hollywood, you have the other 2 screens that show maybe only Nollywood to manage your costs. So at least that way you don't lose out entirely. Right. I think that's a model that perhaps that works best. But again, once you're at that point, I wouldn't call you a community cinema anymore.
Right. Okay. Well, there's a question here from Oluranti who is asking a question that I think is on many people's minds as well. Are streaming platforms a threat to the future of the cinema culture? I see. It's a question you get a lot, right?
I do get it, and I know nobody. It's a question that will keep coming up. So I see it this way. Now there are people who say, "Oh no, it's not a threat at all." Blah blah blah. I think that's a lie. I think that I think there's some threat at the minimum. Having said that, I think that if I look at the threats and the opportunities, and I look at the pros and the cons of streaming platforms, I think that they are a net positive to the industry, and I'll explain why I said so. So on one side, you may lose some content that should come to cinema that goes straight to streaming, even though their current model is that all films should go to cinema. That's their current model now. It can change again tomorrow, but right now what they're saying is films should go to cinema first. But I think that, so while you may lose some films, because what the streamers will do is come for the best producers, the best filmmakers, buy the films directly of them. So the cinema will be starved of some of the great content, right? And I think that while that can be a problem for cinema, the other thing that streamers do is streamers invest a lot in content as well that we don't generally. So over the last 5 years, I think we will all agree that the quality of Nollywood has generally gone up significantly, from films like Jago Jagun to Gangs of Lagos to Christmas in Lagos to King of Boys to, all the films that these are not the quality of films we're making 10 years ago, to Anikulapo and so on. These are not films we're making 10 years ago in Hollywood. And the reason why that is because streamers came in with significant considering the size of our own market, because money is not a lot compared to what they're doing in other countries. They invested quite a bit in our industry. So filmmakers are able to express themselves. They're able to do things that they only imagined before. You had films that you had action films in Nollywood. You had, and even the epic. Southwest have been shooting epic for years. It's just that now the scale of the epic is something else. But that's also because of the streaming money that's coming, and people can now afford to spend a few hundreds of millions on these films, and people are able to cast better. They're able to cast, international stars with local stars because of that. So at the end of the day, that value is significant for the entire industry, right? And even if some films will go to cinema, some of those films, and a good number of those films will go to cinema first. So at the end of the day, I think that streaming, when I look at the pros and the cons of it, I look at the effect it has on the industry, I think it's a net positive for the industry. The sort of things that we're doing today, I think we needed that catalyst of the streaming income that has come in over the last 5-6 years, of the streaming involvement, to nudge the country to the next, or not the industry to the next level. So for me, are they a threat? I think that it's a manageable threat, is what I'll say. It's a contained threat. It's not a threat that is going to wipe out the industry. It's a contained threat that can affect here and there. There may be a bit, some punches here and there, blows here and there. But when I look at it as a whole, I think that streaming platforms have done significantly more for this industry over the last 5 to 10 years. That's what I think.
Great. Now, you mentioned the aspect of funding, which truly is important, and I think it's very clear they have supported the industry in that way. There have been attempts by various local players to set up streaming platforms, local streaming platforms. Do you see a future in that, given that, as you said, funding is short in our industry? So for a local platform to have the kind of funding to be able to commission films and this kind of things, I think it's a real challenge. Do you really see that we will at some point have strong local streaming platforms?
I don't even think there is a case of we will. I think we must at some point. It is a must, and I know a number of people have tried and haven't quite succeeded. The person who is, the newest one now is called Circuit TV. They're not a streaming platform, they transaction VOD platform. So you buy the film and then you watch. And I think that, you know, it's extremely important that at some point, and it's a conversation that, you know, has to be had, you know, and people have to be able to access low cost funding to be able to scale that sort of business, because ultimately as an industry, we cannot. So what has happened over the last 1 year is Amazon has pulled out, Netflix is not commissioning original. So all of a sudden the industry is quiet, you know, and you can't build an industry on somebody's decision in LA or just deciding what to do. And that's fine. They are doing what's good for their business. That is, you cannot tell them, it's not by force. They cannot, you can't say they must invest in your country. You know, it's what they will look at the different countries, they'll look at their return on investment, and they will decide what works for them. And that, you know, so you can't stop them from, you know, coming or going. But what you can do is build your own local capacity, whether it's that we build our own local streaming platforms or we have a strategic 3 to 5 year plan to build our own TV network like they have in France. You know, France has a strong TV, culture where, you know, I'm not sure if that's still the case, but at some point, you need a whole year before you can even go to Netflix or any of those things in France. Anything you make must stay in TV. Now, the thing about it, but they get paid. Government supports it. It's not that they're just saying, don't sell it. Is that they're providing the funding to say, look, this film should be in French TV, and this is the amount of funding that is available for it, so that people are not, you're not at the mercy, you know, of the global streaming platforms. You know, and instead it's more of a collaboration with the global streaming platforms. So we have to get to that point in our own country as well over the next 5 to 10 years if we want to sustain even the growth that we've seen over the last, say, 5-7 years from streaming and all of that. If we want to sustain it, there has to be local platforms. So I'm rooting for Circuit TV to succeed, you know, and hopefully a few more come up that will take Nigerian content to the world and truly export Nigerian content to the world. You know? And I think that those are initiatives that the government must support. You know? So, I mean, I know there are a number of people also trying to do new things, but, you know, for us as distributors now thinking purely as a distributor and a producer, you know, for the ecosystem to work, it's important that we find a way to partner with those guys as well, so that there's content, you know, can get to the world and all of that. So it's something we must do, actually.
Very good point. Very good points. Really, I fully agree with you. Great. Let me turn to Anthony's question. He says, thanks so much for sharing your experience. As you know, AI is everywhere. Given your involvement in production, development, exhibition arms of the industry, in which of these areas is AI most used? How are AI tools being used? Thank you.
Okay, so I would say that I think the place that AI will be, I think it's going to affect the entire chain. But I think perhaps where it will be most, 2 areas where I think will be most impactful, we're probably not seen as much in our own local business yet, will be in production and, in my view, distribution. And I'll tell you why. To a certain extent, exhibition as well. But I'll tell you why I say production, because part of the strike in Hollywood over the last 2-3 years is really about the use of AI and the impact on production. Because, you know, for people who produce, if you shoot a film, most times you shoot a film, you know, maybe you have some, you know, sound issues, and then you need to do ADR. You need to call the actors back to, you know, maybe go over the lines again. With AI, you don't need the actors anymore. So there are a lot of things that AI makes significantly easier and, you know, helps in the production process. The problem with that is that it takes income away from the producers, from the actors. So typically, perhaps they will call you to do 1, 2, 3, and you get paid as part of your contract. Now, once they have your image and they have everything, they probably don't, and they have your voice. AI can maybe even do better than you, you know. So they don't need to pay you. So it's one of the things that created the strike. And even writing. Now AI can't write a script for you, but there's a lot of things that it can do, you know. So A lot of the contentious areas was, how do you protect the writers? How do you protect the actors?
Yes.
So that, after I've given of myself, and then you then use technology to refine it and take it off me, and don't pay me, anymore. So those were a lot of the things. So I think it's going to have a lot of impact on production. Distribution, I think in terms of data, we'll know what is going where, who is watching what. I think that data analytics will be a big deal. So which is why I think that that's where there will be some impact. And on the exhibition side, I think just improvement in technology, and just general the experience of cinemas. But I think by far the biggest area of potential disruption is in production.
Do we have much of that happening here in Nigeria currently?
I'm not aware, not yet. I know that I not at the scale that is that is impacting anything.
Okay, great. There's a question from Lawrence who says, in the last few years, most of the successful box office Nollywood films are produced by women. What is your take on this new development?
It's not a new development. It's been like that for a while in Nollywood. It's a bit of I don't have, so personally, I don't have any issues with it. I think that the creative industry, is what it is. It's creative. I'm not sure why there are not more men getting involved. But I don't think it's been so there are men involved in other areas. I think that obviously in the infrastructure area of the business, there are more men in that area. But generally, I don't think it's a trend that's been there for a number of years. It's honestly, I'm not really sure why that is the case. Because in other countries, it's not like that. So Nigeria is a special case. But for me, I think I don't see it as, I don't see any problem with it. I think that there are a number of men who are also trying to do things in the industry like myself, so, but I think I think it's a good development. I have absolutely no issues with it.
Okay, thank you. Well, Jason is asking, can a distributor sign a pre-sales agreement after reviewing a very engaging and creative pitch deck?
It depends on what you mean by pre-sales. Typically, when you see a pitch deck, you can sign an agreement, but it's conditional on execution, conditional on timing, conditional on a lot of things. So yes, it is possible. Simple answer, yes, but it's typically a conditional thing.
Then Olurant is asking if you can rate the impact of the funding by the CBN for the creative industry on production and cinema facilities establishment.
I would say that on the cinema side, if it's possible to give 100%, I'll give 100%, because they did quite a lot on the exhibition side. I don't know that it was as much more impactful, speaking about the CBN specifically, on the production side of things. I don't know how much impact, but I don't know that it was that impactful. But I know that they did a number of cinemas access. Well, maybe not 100%. Let me say the big chains were able to access, a number of the big chains were able to access funding. And I'm aware that funding helped, particularly during the COVID period. So that intervention was very good. But I don't know that it was as impactful in the production side of things.
Okay. Now, we have been talking about Nollywood, and really down here you could say in the South, is what many people are exposed to. But in this country, well, there's the Kannywood, for instance. And there's not too much, you could say, integration, if I can use that word, between what happens in the North and what happens down here in the South. How, from your perspective as a distributor, what will be the causes? What would you say are the reasons for that? I know that, yes, you have differences in cultural approach, so on and so forth, but you find out that to a large extent, many people in the South really have never been exposed to films from that part of the country.
I think that goes back to your one of the first questions you asked about African stories, because the North is part of Africa, the Northern, but I don't know that those of us who live in the South and who grew up in the South of the country are exposed even to the Northern way of life, in quotes. So there will be a gap in terms of relatability. I also don't know how strong. I mean, I know that they're very good Northern stories told. A couple have been on Netflix. The few that have been on Netflix were told by Southerners as well. So, but they did very well on Netflix. So that tells you that there's a prospect there. But generally speaking, I think that the South, is probably the hub of production of making films. I'm not sure how to bridge that gap. I think there probably has to be maybe some sort of government intervention. And that's not to say that there's not a lot going on, because we're also a number of groups where the northern filmmakers, and there's quite a long number of things going on in the north. So, but definitely the south is doing a lot more. I'm not really sure how to bridge the gap, to be honest. But yeah, a number of whenever good northern stories come out, we see the potential and the prospect of it. We haven't seen a lot in cinemas. Also maybe because it's a very expensive venture that has no guarantees, and that's how it is everywhere anyway. Particularly in our country. So I also know that there are certain restrictions around. I guess also maybe when people are afraid of regulation. I know that I was on a project we're working on, and it was supposed to be a northern character, and this. And people on the group said, please, I don't want to wild out. Let them not say I said, and all of that, that sort of thing. So maybe there are also some soft issues where you maybe misrepresent religion by mistake or unintentionally, and it becomes, the entire project. You don't know how the reaction is going to be. So I think there are also a lot of soft issues in that area as well, when it comes to.
Thank you very much. I do agree with you there, because I know that it is, well, thriving really as a sector, but there's always a complaint about all of these various issues, the funding, the regulation, and so on, which does tend to restrict things a bit. But there is a wide audience. So I think really in line with what you were saying earlier about dealing or producing content for specific audiences, different things for different people. That is one that perhaps I think we all need to pay some attention to, because the audience for that films is not just people in the north. It extends beyond really the borders of this country to various countries that consume a lot of the content from Nollywood. So it's quite an audience. One last question from me. The introduction of the new ministry, the ministry that focuses now on the creative industries, well, quite a few things have been listed that the ministry wants to promote, so on and so forth. What is your assessment in terms of how do you, as a player in this industry, or how can you, as a player in this industry, benefit from what the ministry is, or the initiatives that the ministry is putting forward?
You want to set me up?
No.
So I think that what I would say is that this ministry, I think, in my view, with my engagements with them, want to lay down the right structures that can drive growth. So things around creating this holding company that would, the government will own part of it and private will own part of it, and that will invest in event centers, in films, in cinema, so on and so forth. They're creating certain structures that can drive growth. They have a vehicle that they want to use for funding and all of that. The downside of it is that creating structures take time. So it would feel as if there's not much going on. And at some point you wonder if anything will get done. That's the truth. You wonder if things are actually going to happen. Add that with the general government bureaucracy, then it becomes, before you know what's happening, 2-3 years and not much has happened. in quotes. So I think that, in my view, I think that for the first time, this government is probably doing a bit more in terms of trying to create a system that one can build up for the future. But the only thing I would say is, while at it, create short-term interventions so that people can, access funding for films, access this, access that, and there's some mid-term things you can do while you're building the structures for the long term. But generally speaking, that's my assessment of the administration. I don't know which ones are available now for anybody to access, or what. Honestly speaking, I'm not aware that there's anything. I know there's also a delegation going to the Cannes Film Festival. I know there are a few things that are happening, but I don't know that there's something that, the filmmaker or the player initially can just wake up and say, okay, you know what, this is one of the things that, the government will do for me right now. I don't know. I think that in a year's time, it will be clearer, how we can all access and benefit. And I know, maybe not even in a year, maybe in a few months' time. Right. I'm aware that there are many things that are being put in place, right? But as of today, it feels like there's not a lot of movement. Even though I think that on the long term, I think in the long term, they're actually building for the future. So
I fully agree with you. And I think it's a fantastic thing that we now have this greater focus on a sector that previously was likely ignored or taken for granted. So there are some advantages here. Now, there are some last questions that have come in. I'll just ask you two of them. Olani is asking, can you work with diaspora filmmakers on production? And Emeka Bovier wants to know if how one can get funding for one's films. Are there funding organizations and grants that one can easily access? And what's your opinion on producing a film from a loan?
Can I work with diaspora people? Yes, I can. Can work with anybody from anywhere in the world. Just depends on story. We're able to agree, how we're going to fund it and all of that. But simple answer is yes. The second question was, there was one about loan. Okay, let me answer the loan one. Okay.
About funding. What's your opinion on how can one get funding? What are the grants available? And what's your opinion on carrying out a production on the basis of a loan?
Okay, my advice usually, if it's a first-time filmmaker, is don't get a loan. And so try and get a grant, but there are very few limited grants. There are hardly any grants. So the other thing, although you can check places like Red Sea, there's a Red Sea fund, Saudi Arabian fund, that's what it's called, Red Sea fund, where they give grants to Africans. So there are a few global funds that you can look at. I don't know that there are any local ones, but my usual advice, first-time filmmakers usually, is raise money from friends and family. That's usually my advice, first-time filmmakers. They will understand. Well, they should. Don't let me say they will. They should understand more the process and all of that, and manage expectations. But if you go to a seasoned investor for your money, or you go to a bank to get a loan, and things don't work out the way you expect it to work out, you're going to be in a bit of trouble, So that's usually my advice. I would, the first set of films we didn't take, obviously we took money from some investors. We didn't take debt intentionally. We can take debt now. We want debt now, but even the debt has to be low-cost debt, not commercial bank debts, because I don't think anybody can survive on that for film. So that's my general advice. But as much as possible, try and raise money from friends and families, from peers who believe in your vision. I think that's always the way to start. That's my thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Ope. Now, for the benefit of the audience, Ope has generously given us his email address. You will find it in the chat box, like he said. So if you have, those for the diaspora and so on who want to reach him, you can reach him there through that email address. So thank you so very much, Ope. This has been most enlightening. And thanks to our audience as well for your questions. They help to move the conversation forward. Thank you. And really, we have to invite you to come and visit us on our campus. I hope you will come. So you see us in situ, so to speak.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks once again. Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us in the edition today.